Imagine toasting the future of two royal dynasties and watching 60 nobles drop dead before dessert. This isn't just medieval history, it's Europe's bloodiest unsolved royal massacre. Imagine toasting the future of two royal dynasties and watching 60 nobles drop dead before dessert. This isn't just medieval history, it's Europe's bloodiest unsolved royal massacre. In the vast chronicles of dark history, few events shimmer with such a blend of beauty and horror as the poisoned wedding of Princess Isabella of Castile and Prince Thierry of Burgundy, a royal wedding massacre so precise, so devastating, that it would forever change how kings and queens approached their most sacred ceremonies. This is no mere footnote tucked into dusty archives. It's a historical true crime that left an entire bloodline erased in a single night and sent shockwaves through every royal court from London to Rome. The year was 1387, a time when Europe staggered under the weight of the 100 Years' War, when kingdoms teetered between prosperity and ruin, and when alliances sealed by marriage could decide the fate of continents. Against this backdrop, the union of Isabella and Tierry promised stability, prosperity, and a political bulwark against chaos, a wedding meant to heal the wounds left by war and ambition. Instead, it turned into a banquet of death, a poisoned feast, whose lethal wine goblets became instruments of calculated slaughter. Beneath silk banners and the glow of countless candles, death waited in crystal glasses measured and prepared with a chemist's precision. Between 40 and 60 nobles perished that night, their bodies sprawled across rush-strewn floors, blood-staining embroidered silks and golden goblets. Historians still debate the conspiracy's architects, and modern forensic experts scour centuries-old clues, seeking answers to Europe's most chilling, unsolved royal mystery. Yet the tragedy's true horror lies not merely in the scale of the killing, but in its cold efficiency, a systematic political assassination masquerading as a sacred union. This story is more than murder. It's a testament to how power can twist joy into terror, how ambition devours even the bonds of blood. Welcome to the tale of the poisoned wedding, a dark history that proves trust in the corridors of power can be more lethal than any sword. The poisoned wedding of Isabella and Tierry did not unfold in a vacuum. To understand why a single royal feast could erupt into one of Europe's bloodiest unsolved royal massacres, we must step back into the storm that was 14th century Europe, a time of dark history where crowns were traded for daggers, and alliances were as fragile as the parchment treaties upon which they were written. It was the year 1387. The echoes of the Black Death still haunted the continent, leaving entire villages, deserted fields overgrown, and power vacuums in courts where death had claimed kings, queens, and countless heirs. Between 30 to 60% of Europe's population had vanished in the decades prior, turning thrones into deadly prizes and transforming the social order into a volatile game of ambition. The 100 Years' War, that seemingly endless conflict between France and England, had already torn apart the soil of France, burning villages, emptying coffers, and leaving kingdoms teetering on collapse. Meanwhile, the Iberian Peninsula simmered under the weight of dynastic feuds, each more vicious than the last, threatening to fracture realms like Castile into rival kingdoms. In this cauldron of chaos, the marriage of Princess Isabella of Castile to Prince Thierry of Burgundy appeared like a beacon of hope, a royal wedding that promised not merely pageantry, but the possibility of peace. Castile, a kingdom born in blood and perpetually sustained by conflict, yearned for stability after years of civil war between Pedro the Cruel and his half-brother Henry of Trastamara. Henry's victory had been bought at a ghastly price, the murder of his own brother, an act of fratricide that stained the royal bloodline and sowed seeds of vengeance that would sprout deadly thorns for generations. Burgundy, by contrast, glittered not with swords, but with gold and silk. Where Castile wielded brute military force, Burgundy commanded the art of diplomacy and the power of trade. The Burgundian court was legendary, a nexus of wealth, cultural sophistication, and political cunning. Prince Thierry embodied that legacy at just 23, said to possess both the sharp mind of a diplomat and the iron will of a battlefield commander. His very name conjured images of a Renaissance prince born before the Renaissance even arrived. For Castile, tying its royal blood to Burgundy meant access to the latter's sprawling trade networks, a lifeline of wealth and influence that could counterbalance French ambitions. For Burgundy, the marriage offered a strategic foothold into the Iberian Peninsula, creating a hedge against the encroaching power of France, ever eager to expand its dominion. On parchment, the match was perfect, a royal alliance designed to secure peace wealth and a bulwark against the chaos-devouring medieval Europe. Yet, in the intricate chess game of medieval politics, every move births countermoves, and this proposed union ignited fires of fear and resentment across royal courts. King Henry of Trastamara, now in his 50s and growing ever more suspicious, saw Isabella's marriage as an existential threat. His grip on the Castilian throne was far from secure, haunted by the specter of Pedro the Cruel's surviving supporters, nobles who had fled to Burgundy and other foreign courts. The notion that his own niece might marry into a dynasty harboring his enemies was intolerable, a dagger poised at his already vulnerable reign. Worse still, any children born of Isabella and Tierry would inherit claims to both Castilian and Burgundian lands, forming a power block capable of challenging Henry's bloodline and undoing the hard-won dominion for which he had murdered his brother. The stakes were not simply personal, they were geopolitical. Thrones could fall, borders could shift. Entire economies trembled on the outcome of this union. Even the choice of Montblanc Castle as the wedding venue was steeped in political calculation. A fortress that had changed hands repeatedly in the tides of regional conflict, Montblanc stood as a symbol of contested power and fragile neutrality. Its current lord, Count Ramon de Prades, was famed for his careful balance between rival factions, a man trusted precisely because he trusted no one. In the months leading up to the wedding, Montblanc transformed into a glittering stage for the might of Europe's nobility. Caravans streamed through its gates bearing nobles, merchants, and emissaries from realms near and far. Silk banners bearing the crimson lions of Castile and the cross of Burgundy fluttered above the ramparts, while rumors and secrets whispered through the stone corridors like a phantom breeze. Each noble arrived not merely as a guest, but as a player in a dangerous game of alliances, debts, and quiet vendettas. Representatives came from France, England, Aragon, Navarre, and the wealthy Italian city-states, each bearing their own motives, grievances, and private agendas. Behind every polite bow and velvet cloak hid calculations that could change the map of Europe. Even as the kitchens roared with preparations for an opulent feast, a poisoned feast, yet unseen, the seeds of betrayal were already taking root. This was not merely a wedding. It was a stage set for a conspiracy whose ripples would spread far beyond the walls of Montblanc. And as silk and steel intertwined beneath those castle towers, no one could yet fathom how soon those wedding bells would toll like funeral dirges. For in just days, beneath the glow of golden chandeliers and the echo of 1,000 footsteps, the union that was meant to heal kingdoms would become a royal wedding massacre that would stain history forever. And so we move closer to that fateful moment, the arrival of Isabella herself, a princess whose beauty and royal bearing would dazzle all who beheld her, and whose fate was already sealed by poison and ambition waiting in the shadows. Montblanc Castle had witnessed centuries of battles, shifting banners, and whispered betrayals, but never had its towering white walls shimmered under so many silk pennants, or echoed with such relentless preparations as in the days leading up to what should have been the most glorious royal wedding of the age. Caravans arrived daily, their wheels crunching over frost-hardened ground as they carried nobles, emissaries, and merchants from nearly every corner of Europe, each bearing tokens of loyalty and secrets heavy as iron. In the grand courtyard, stable boys struggled to manage hundreds of finely bred horses, their breath steaming in the crisp September air, while servants darted back and forth carrying bolts of damask and casks of wine destined for the great hall. Inside the castle's stone chambers, tailors stitched gold thread into robes, chandeliers were polished until they reflected torchlight like captured stars, and musicians rehearsed haunting melodies meant to underscore vows of eternal union. Yet even amid this feverish activity, a strange tension pulsed like an unseen vein beneath the surface. In dark history, few events illustrate better how beauty and dread can exist side by side than these final days before the poisoned wedding, a historical true crime waiting to happen. The castle had become a crucible where power, ambition, and silent terror boiled together, each noble's presence hinting at alliances too dangerous to speak aloud. Princess Isabella of Castile arrived 3 days before the ceremony, and though she was only 19, her entrance was as dramatic and dazzling as the legends would later recount in countless ballads. Her procession stretched nearly a mile, an unbroken line of knights in gleaming armor, ladies in waiting in gowns of deep crimson and standard bearers, lifting the lion crest of Castile high above the crowd. As Isabella dismounted at the gates of Mont Blanc, witnesses could not help but stare in reverence. With her dark hair cascading like silk over her white fur-lined cloak, and eyes so intensely black they seemed to drink in every flicker of torchlight, she was hailed as one of the great beauties of her generation, a living symbol of royal grace. Yet even in her radiant presence there lingered a subtle shadow. Chroniclers would later note a quiet determination beneath her poised smile, as if Isabella herself sensed the weight of her political fate pressing heavily on her slender shoulders. Letters preserved in dusty archives reveal she had corresponded with Tierry for months, before ever laying eyes on him, their words hinting at both political calculation and the fragile hope of personal happiness. She wrote once, "May God grant that our union be not merely of kingdoms, but of hearts," a line now steeped in tragic irony for all who know how this poisoned feast would end. Prince Thierry's arrival the following day was no less spectacular, and perhaps even more calculated in its display of Burgundy's wealth and power, a perfect blend of courtly elegance and barely veiled political messaging. His retinue entered Mont Blanc with wagons laden with gifts that left even the most jaded nobles murmuring in awe. Rare wines from the Rhine Valley tapestries depicting scenes of chivalric triumph and jewels that glittered like shards of ice under torchlight, all these treasures poured into the castle as living proof that Burgundy was a kingdom not merely of warriors, but of refined taste and economic might. Thierry himself, tall and broad-shouldered, radiated the confident bearing of a man born to command both battlefield and council chamber. His purple velvet doublet shimmered under the great arches of Mont Blanc's gates, trimmed in delicate fur, each gesture of his hand performed with an unconscious nobility that spoke volumes. To those who witnessed his first meeting with Isabella, a carefully staged ritual set in the moonlit courtyard, their initial conversation seemed filled with genuine warmth, laughter, and perhaps the first tentative flickers of affection. Chroniclers wrote that for a moment, the alliance did not feel merely political, but alive with possibility. Yet, beneath the glow of lanterns and the gentle strains of music, others saw fleeting glances of apprehension crossing both their faces, as if some instinct whispered that this union might come at a terrible price. The castle itself became a living organism, pulsing with secrets and silent negotiations as the wedding drew near. Delegations from France, England, Aragon, Navarre, and the wealthy Italian city-states wove through Mont Blanc's echoing halls, each faction cloaked in velvet and suspicion. Conversations were conducted in hushed tones behind tapestries, and rumors spread like wildfire through the ranks of servants and courtiers. Some spoke of King Henry of Trastamara's conspicuous absence officially due to illness, but privately whispered to be a calculated insult or perhaps something far darker. Others noticed Italian merchants lingering too long in the castle kitchens, or a mysterious woman robed like a nun gliding through corridors, her presence evoking a chill that no amount of candlelight could banish. All the while, the kitchen fires roared night and day, preparing dishes whose spices and sauces masked not merely flavor, but potentially lethal secrets. The days leading up to the wedding were a study in contrasts, a breathtaking spectacle poised above an abyss. While silk banners rustled softly in the breeze, political fault lines deepened with every passing hour, and somewhere in the castle's labyrinthine passages, death was already being measured and mixed. The stage was set, the players assembled, and beneath layers of pageantry and hope lay a darkness waiting to burst forth. And so as dawn broke on the 15th of September, Mont Blanc Castle stood ready to bear witness to a royal wedding destined to become one of history's darkest chapters, a chapter whose first words would be spoken in the chapel, where Isabella and Tierry were about to swear eternal devotion, unaware that eternity would last only hours more. The morning of September 15th, 1387, dawned over Mont Blanc Castle, casting pale gold light across the jagged mountain peaks, as if the heavens themselves were trying to bless what was about to unfold. A royal wedding meant to unite two of the most powerful dynasties in medieval Europe. Yet beneath that serene glow, a sense of foreboding hung like a chill fog, clinging to the castle's white stone. In the pages of dark history, this day would become infamous as the opening act to Europe's bloodiest unsolved royal massacre, a poisoned feast in waiting, cloaked for now in silks and hymns. The great bells of Mont Blanc tolled, calling nobles and clergy into the castle's ancient chapel, a space whose vaulted arches and stained glass windows glowed with jewel-like colors under the rising sun. The air was thick with incense, carrying scents of frankincense and myrrh, mingling with the nervous breaths of hundreds who gathered to witness the historical true crime that no one yet suspected was about to erupt. Princess Isabella of Castile entered the chapel, and an audible hush swept through the noble ranks as eyes turned toward her. She wore a gown of white silk embroidered with threads of pure gold, each shimmering design a testament to Castile's wealth and power. Her hair, as dark as a raven's wing, was crowned with a delicate circlet set with rubies that caught the flickering candlelight like blood drops. In that instant, she seemed the very embodiment of regal purity, a princess stepping into legend unaware she was also walking toward her death. Chroniclers would later describe how her eyes sparkled with hope, a young woman who believed she was sealing not only a political pact, but perhaps finding love a fragile possibility so rare among dynasties forged in blood and treaties. Her letters to Thierry, written in the months leading up to this day, spoke of a desire for something more than politics, a genuine bond. One surviving line reads, "Let there be peace in our hearts as well as our lands." Words that would become tragically ironic before the day ended. Then came Prince Thierry of Burgundy. As he stepped into the chapel, whispers rippled through the pews. Tall and broad-shouldered, he was dressed in a robe of deep purple velvet, edged in miniver fur, so white it gleamed like snow. A jeweled dagger hung at his belt, a silent reminder that, in the medieval courts, even joy was accompanied by the shadow of violence. Thierry's face, handsome and composed, wore a solemn calm, but those closest to the altar claimed that for a fleeting second, his gaze found Isabella's, and something unspoken passed between them, a mixture of affection, apprehension, and an instinctive dread neither could name. It was the look of two souls realizing that destiny was steering them toward a place darker than any vow could illuminate. At the altar stood the Archbishop of Tagona, his robes heavy with gold embroidery, his voice echoing solemn Latin prayers that rolled through the chapel like thunder in distant mountains. He opened an illuminated manuscript specially commissioned for this day, its vellum pages gilded and painted with scenes of saints and royal coats of arms, a testament to the grandeur surrounding this union. As he began the sacred rite, witnesses reported an almost supernatural stillness descending upon the hall, as though the entire congregation was holding its collective breath. Even the flickering candles seemed to sway less, as if the air itself refused to disturb this moment. Yet beneath the grandeur, a subtle tension coiled tighter with every passing minute, a medieval conspiracy waiting to spring. When Isabella and Tierry recited their vows, their voices were strong, echoing through the hushed chapel. Yet Lady Beatrice de Mendoza, who stood close enough to see the fine tremors in Isabella's hands, would later testify that the young princess's smile faltered just for a heartbeat, as though a shadow had fallen across her future. The exchange of rings gleamed like captured starlight, the final binding of two bloodlines meant to forge a powerful alliance across Europe's fractured kingdoms. Applause rippled through the pews and music soared as nobles rose to their feet, lifting their jeweled hands in salute. On the surface, it was a spectacle of triumph, a moment seemingly destined for the annals of royal pageantry, destined to inspire ballads sung in every hall from Castile to Burgundy. But history would record otherwise. For hidden among the guests were those who saw this marriage not as salvation, but as threat, a threat so profound it justified murder on a scale few could imagine. Even as the Archbishop blessed the couple somewhere deeper in Mont Blanc's labyrinthine corridors, goblets were being arranged, dishes were being selected, and the ingredients for a massacre were already waiting unseen, but ready to spill blood onto the polished stone floors. And in this chapel beneath stained glass glowing like jewels, two young royals stood unaware that their vows were not the beginning of a long reign together, but the overture to a banquet of death. And so, as the wedding procession filed from the chapel toward the great hall, laughter mingling with the chiming of silver bells, no one could guess that within hours the royal wedding massacre would erupt, a poisoned feast that would drown Montblanc's brilliance in scream silence and the crimson stain of treachery. As the final echoes of the wedding hymns faded into the vaulted arches of Montblanc's chapel, a sense of fragile triumph seemed to envelop the castle. Trumpets blared, the heavy wooden doors swung open, and nobles streamed out into the crisp September air, their silks and velvets catching the pale sunlight like waves of crimson and gold. Everywhere faces glowed with cautious hope. For a fleeting moment it felt as though this royal wedding might indeed fulfill its promise to bind together Castile and Burgundy, to bring a fragile peace to a continent battered by war and plague. But in the hidden annals of dark history, appearances are often nothing more than veils draped over catastrophe. And what awaited the royal guests inside Montblanc's Great Hall was destined to become one of Europe's bloodiest unsolved royal massacres, a historical true crime that would echo across centuries. The Great Hall was a masterpiece of medieval architecture, its high timbered ceiling soaring like a cathedral nave draped with banners bearing the Lion of Castile and the Cross of Burgundy. Chandeliers hung from iron chains, each studded with hundreds of beeswax candles that cast a golden glow over tables laden with shimmering platters and goblets of hammered silver. The scent of roasted meats, exotic spices, and sweet pastries rose like incense, mingling with the sharp tang of spilled wine. Yet for all its splendor, the hall thrummed with a tension that few could name, but many felt. Lady Beatrice de Mendoza, whose keen eyes missed little, would later recall a curious silence beneath the chatter, a sense that laughter was too loud, that smiles stretched a touch too tight, as though everyone was waiting for some hidden blade to fall. The seating arrangement itself was a map of Europe's delicate power balance, drawn not only in bloodlines but in grievances and secret alliances. The high table gleamed at the head of the hall, reserved for the bride and groom. The most powerful dukes, counts, and bishops gathered like glittering jewels around them. Below the tables, fanned outward in precise ranks, each placement a signal of favor or warning. In the medieval courts, where every glance and gesture carried political weight, such arrangements were more than etiquette, they were potential weapons. And on this day they would make the task of the poisoners infinitely easier. The feast began at noon, each course an escalating spectacle of culinary excess, designed to dazzle not only taste buds, but the senses and the political ambitions of every realm represented. The first course arrived in a procession of servants clad in livery, carrying silver tureens brimming with soups, fragrant with saffron and cinnamon, a rare extravagance in a time when such spices were more valuable than gold. Guests dipped carved ivory spoons into the steaming broth, laughing as they exchanged tidings of alliances, trade routes, and in whispers, rumors of who might yet emerge triumphant in Europe's endless game of thrones. As the second course was unveiled, gasps rippled through the hall. Roasted swans were born in their white feathers, plucked and then carefully replaced gilded beaks shining in the candlelight. Pastries shaped like castles and ships arrived on ornate platters, each a subtle message of territorial ambitions and naval prowess. Wine flowed like rivers, deep reds from Burgundy, pale golds from Aragon, poured by servants who moved with choreographed grace, ensuring no goblet remained empty for long. Yet amid this display, shadows gathered. A handful of nobles declined certain dishes, citing fasting for religious reasons, a detail that would later become one of the keys to the investigation that would follow this poisoned feast. Others sipped their wine cautiously, exchanging glances that hinted at secrets they dared not voice. Even the music performed by lute players and harpists perched upon a raised platform seemed to stumble now and then, as if the notes themselves feared the darkness lurking beneath this veneer of celebration. At the high table, Prince Thierry and Princess Isabella presided like the stars of a royal tableau, their hands brushing occasionally, their smiles softening, as though despite the weight of political machinations swirling around them, they still clung to the fragile hope of a real marriage of genuine affection. Tierry, resplendent in purple velvet, raised his goblet in toast after toast, his voice carrying across the hall proclaiming alliances, unity, and the dawn of a new era. Isabella's laughter light, yet edged with a trace of nerves, floated over the guests. Some claimed afterward that in the depths of her dark eyes flickered an unspoken warning, as though she felt invisible threads tightening around her fate. Meanwhile, unseen by the revelers, certain figures slipped in and out of the kitchens. Italian merchants whispered instructions to cooks. A woman cloaked like a nun was glimpsed gliding through side corridors, only to vanish when guards approached. All the while, the castle's massive hearths blazed, roasting meats whose juices hissed and spat in the fire, a symphony of sound, masking quieter, more sinister acts unfolding among the shadows. And so the afternoon waned, each course bringing more splendor, more laughter, and more hidden peril. As the third course prepared to emerge from the kitchens, a parade of delicacies destined for the highest ranks. No one in the great hall could imagine that the next moments would explode into convulsions, screams, and a crimson tide that would transform this royal wedding into Europe's most notorious medieval conspiracy. For even now, death was being poured into crystal goblets measured in lethal doses, waiting to turn Mont Blanc's feast into a charnel house where the only music would be the rattling gasps of the dying. And thus, as candles guttered lower and servants lifted silver domes to reveal the next lavish dishes, the great hall hovered on the brink, balanced between the shimmering illusion of peace and the abyss of murder, ready for the first sign that the poisoned feast had begun. It began so quietly that for an instant, no one in the great hall noticed that history itself had just pivoted on a poisoned edge. A single cough punctured the music as servants carried out the third course, an opulent array of roasted meats, marinated fish, shimmering in saffron sauce and crystal decanters, filled with the richest wines Burgundy had ever sent across the Pyrenees. A harpist faltered mid-note. Then Count Fernando Duna, seated among the Castilian nobles, reached for his throat, his fingers clawing at the high velvet collar of his doublet. His face blanched, then darkened eyes bulging as a strangled gasp tore from his lips. In dark history, there are moments when the grandeur of kings dissolves into raw terror, and in that instant, the royal wedding massacre announced itself with lethal finality. At first, the nobles around Count Duna simply stared, trapped in the stunned etiquette of courtly life, unable to comprehend that a man of royal blood could convulse and collapse like any common peasant. But within heartbeats, the hall erupted into chaos. All at once, screams rose like a tide as others began to falter in their seats. A bishop toppled from his chair, crimson wine spilling over his vestments like a wound. A lady of Navarre shrieked as her husband slumped forward, dark froth spilling from his lips. Throughout the hall, men and women clutched at their throats, eyes rolling back as spasms racked their bodies. Servants dropped trays, goblets fell and shattered, splashing poisoned wine across gowns embroidered with gold. The smell of roasted swan and cinnamon-scented pastries was swiftly overtaken by the acrid reek of vomit, sweat, and blood. Lady Beatrice de Mendoza, her stomach too ill to let her eat more than a few mouthfuls that day, would later testify to the horror she witnessed. The air was filled with the rattling gasps of dying men and the rustle of silk against the floor as bodies fell. She would write her account preserved in the archives of the Cathedral of Toledo. I saw my cousin Isabella's face change from joy to confusion, then to terror. She reached for Prince Tierry as he fell, and in her eyes I saw the knowledge that someone close had betrayed her. And there at the high table the tragedy struck its cruelest blow. Prince Tierry, resplendent in purple velvet moments earlier, suddenly stiffened, his goblet slipping from nerveless fingers. Dark blood flecked his lips as he struggled to draw breath, his powerful frame convulsing in a grotesque parody of royal dignity. Isabella, eyes wide with horror, rushed to his side, grasping his hand even as his body pitched forward. Witnesses described the young bride's desperate attempts to speak, her lips forming words no one could hear over the shrieks and the crash of chairs. Then Isabella herself staggered, her white silk gown stained red as she collapsed across Thierry's chest. In the twisted annals of historical true crime, no scene is more chilling, a royal bride and groom dying in each other's arms, their marriage hours old, their union sealed not in hope, but in blood. Not everyone succumbed, and that fact would become a crucial clue in the investigation that followed. Some nobles who abstained from certain dishes or wines survived unscathed, huddling in corners, faces ashen as they watched friends and rivals writhe in agony. This selective mortality proved beyond doubt that the massacre was no accident, no outbreak of disease or foul kitchen mishap. It was, as historians and toxicologists would later determine, a calculated assassination, executed with lethal precision, a medieval conspiracy that turned a royal wedding into a charnel house. Speculation has swirled for centuries over the exact poisons used. Contemporary chronicles describe symptoms of rapid paralysis, frothing at the mouth convulsions, all pointing to substances like cyanide derived from bitter almonds or cherry laurel, or perhaps hemlock or wolfsbane. Some modern forensic historians suggest multiple toxins were employed, each carefully calibrated to kill certain individuals while sparing others long enough to spread confusion. The staggering complexity of the plot hinted at months, perhaps years, of planning down to knowledge of seating charts and serving protocols. No outsider could have executed such surgical slaughter. This was an inside job, an unsolved royal mystery whose perpetrators vanished into the smoke and terror of that single catastrophic evening. In the aftermath of the initial wave, the Great Hall became an infernal tableau of dark history. Tables stood overturned, food scattered across blood-soaked rushes. Nobles lay sprawled where they had fallen, the jewels on their garments glinting like stars extinguished in a dark sky. Some survivors tried frantically to save the dying, forcing fingers down throats to induce vomiting or dragging limp bodies toward open doors for air. Others fled outright, bolts sliding shut behind them as guards sealed the gates, uncertain whether they were containing a killer or trapping more victims inside. By the time the sun dipped below the mountain peaks that day, the Great Hall of Mont Blanc, which mere hours before had rung with laughter and music, lay in silence, broken only by the sobs of the living and the gurgling death rattles of those still fading away. And as night fell over Mont Blanc, casting shadows through the tall stained glass windows, the scale of the massacre began to emerge. Not merely the murder of individuals, but the calculated obliteration of an entire political faction. 40 to 60 nobles lay dead or dying, not counting the countless servants and retainers who succumbed afterward from leftovers, tainted with the same invisible killers. And at the very heart of this catastrophe, two royal corpses, Isabella and Tierry, lay entwined, the promise of a new political dawn, extinguished before it had even begun. Thus did the royal wedding massacre erupt, transforming Mont Blanc's feast from a symbol of hope into a lasting scar upon Europe's soul. And in the terrible silence that followed, the question remained: who in the corridors of power had dared turn joy into slaughter, and why? A question whose pursuit would plunge kingdoms into chaos and begin a hunt for answers that even 6 centuries later remains unsolved. When the last echoes of dying screams faded into the stone walls of Mont Blanc, the Great Hall lay transformed from a palace of celebration into a cathedral of death. Chandeliers dripped wax onto overturned tables. Silken banners, once symbols of hope and union, hung limp, spattered with crimson sprays. In the annals of dark history, few images haunt the mind as fiercely as this: a royal wedding massacre that turned one of Europe's most magnificent fortresses into a butcher's stage. As twilight bled across the mountains, the silence that settled over the castle was not peace, but shock, a paralysis born of horror, disbelief, and the dawning knowledge that the fate of kingdoms had shifted in a single afternoon. By the time dusk fell, bodies lay sprawled across rush-strewn floors, their once splendid garments soaked with sweat wine and darker stains. The stench of roasted meats now mixed with bile and blood, creating a miasma that forced many survivors to retch where they stood. Outside, the courtyards bustled with chaos as guards sealed the gates, desperate to control who entered or escaped. No one knew whether the poisoners still stalked the corridors or if more murder lay waiting in the shadows. Some nobles demanded immediate departure while others refused to leave, convinced they would be hunted down if they dared step beyond the walls. In this confusion, old alliances splintered and new fears took root, for, in the deadly silence of that poisoned feast, trust itself had died. Lady Beatrice de Mendoza, trembling and pale but alive, moved like a ghost among the dying. Her white gloves stained red as she tried to comfort nobles she'd danced with only hours before. In a voice hushed and ragged, she would later recount how she witnessed Isabella's final moments, her cousin's eyes locked on Tierry even as life ebbed away. It was as if she understood at the last that someone she loved or someone she trusted had doomed them all. Those words preserved in the Cathedral of Toledo would become one of the few human threads connecting modern historians to the monstrous conspiracy that remains to this day one of Europe's greatest unsolved royal mysteries. Not every guest lay dying. A number of nobles, remarkably untouched by the poison's grasp, stood amid the devastation their faces, a tableau of disbelief and guilt. Why had they been spared? Almost immediately, whispers swirled through the hall, forming new conspiracies within the broader medieval conspiracy already unfolding. Some pointed fingers at those who had conveniently fasted for religious reasons, abstaining from the deadly courses. Others noted who had chosen certain wines, who avoided certain meats. Survivors glanced around in terror, realizing that knowledge of seating charts, wine assignments, and kitchen routes could only belong to someone deeply embedded within the heart of the wedding's planning, a fact that added a new layer of horror to the massacre. As the initial shock gave way to grim practicality, servants were ordered to clear the hall to separate the dead from the living. Guards dragged nobles into adjoining chambers, hoping fresh air might stave off the poison's effects. Physicians arrived summoned from among the Burgundian retinues and Castilian households, but their treatments were futile. Leeches, purging, and herbal concoctions could do nothing against the complex alchemy at play. Every new death drove home the certainty that this was no accident, but a carefully orchestrated mass assassination, the ultimate historical true crime. By nightfall, the body count began to emerge. Conservative estimates placed the dead at 43 nobles of varying rank, though many believed the number far higher when factoring in servants and retainers who succumbed later. Among the slain were dukes, counts, bishops, and knights whose names traced centuries of bloodlines through the Reconquista and beyond. In a single monstrous stroke, entire noble houses were wiped from existence, leaving political vacuums that would spiral into chaos across multiple realms. One chronicler writing decades later captured it best. It was as though the sun itself fell from the sky, and all Europe was plunged into a darkness no dawn could banish. Yet while bodies were still being counted, the real war shifted to a different battlefield, that of suspicion and blame. Questions flared hotter than any torch burning in Mont Blanc's walls. Why had King Henry of Trastamara not attended, citing illness? Why had several of his trusted agents survived unscathed? Why had Count of Foix departed the castle on the morning of the feast under a veil of urgency? Why had Italian merchants been seen whispering with the kitchen staff, or a mysterious nun-like figure gliding through corridors, only to vanish before the massacre erupted? Each rumor seeded 1,000 new fears. And in the tense hours that followed, alliances crumbled as each faction raced to protect its secrets, lest suspicion devour them next. Before dawn could rise over blood-stained banners, nobles were already dispatching messengers to distant courts. Emergency councils were called in London, Paris, and Rome, and sovereigns across Europe grappled with a single terrifying truth. If such a massacre could unfold amid the sacred vows of a royal wedding, nowhere was truly safe. The very customs that had once bound kingdoms together, hospitality, sacred ceremony, the shared table now lay shattered, replaced by an atmosphere of paranoia and dread. And so began the labyrinthine hunt for answers, a desperate scramble to uncover who had orchestrated the poisoned feast, and why a hunt that even 6 centuries later remains clouded in shadows and silence. Thus, as the first pale rays of dawn crept through Mont Blanc's narrow windows, illuminating the carnage of Europe's most notorious royal wedding massacre, a single question echoed through every corridor, every trembling survivor's heart. Who dared commit such treachery in the very halls meant to celebrate eternal union? A question whose pursuit would pull back the velvet curtains on some of medieval Europe's darkest secrets and plunge kingdoms into an even deeper spiral of conspiracy, vengeance, and war. When the dawn finally broke over Mont Blanc, casting its pale light over the fortress's frost-kissed battlements, Europe awoke to a world irrevocably changed. What had begun as a royal wedding destined to unite dynasties now lay in shattered fragments, a dark history stained with blood suspicion and the silent promise of vengeance. Even before the last bodies were cleared from the Great Hall, the questions began to ripple outward like poison poured into a clear stream. Who orchestrated the royal wedding massacre, and why the hunt for answers ignited what would become one of medieval Europe's most convoluted and ultimately unsolved royal mysteries. King Henry of Trastamara's absence loomed large over every whispered conversation. Officially, he had pleaded illness, but the timing now reeked of calculation. His trusted agents conspicuously present at Mont Blanc emerged miraculously untouched by the poisoned feast, a fact that fueled speculation among both survivors and chroniclers. And some claimed these men had been fasting for religious reasons, conveniently sparing themselves the fatal dishes. Others believed they carried antidotes prepared in secret. Rumors multiplied like shadows at dusk, weaving Henry into the tapestry of conspiracy as its mastermind, a sovereign who would sacrifice family faith and any remnant of honor to secure his fragile throne. Yet Henry was far from the only suspect. The Count of Foix, who slipped away from the castle mere hours before the feast, quickly became another focus of suspicion. He had long harbored resentments against both Castilian and Burgundian interests, and his departure seemed eerily well-timed. Italian merchants, powerful emissaries of banking houses whose fortunes hinged on European alliances, were observed speaking in hushed tones with the castle's kitchen staff days before the massacre. Some historians speculate they feared losing influence over Iberian trade should Castile and Burgundy unite a financial motive potent enough to spill noble blood. And then there was the enigmatic figure of the nun. Witnesses recalled her presence in Mont Blanc's corridors, her habit impeccable, her bearing noble, her eyes watchful, but on the day of the massacre she vanished, as if swallowed by the stones themselves, leaving only speculation in her wake. Was she an agent of France seeking to prevent a dangerous alliance? A loyalist to the slain Pedro the Cruel, thirsting for vengeance? Or something more arcane woven into the realm of legend? Amid these swirling suspicions, investigations fragmented along the fault lines of European politics. Rather than unite in pursuit of justice, kingdoms guarded secrets and evidence like crown jewels. France launched its own inquiry, determined to unearth any ties to potential rivals, while Burgundy plunged into grief and paranoia. Duke Philip, the bold father to the murdered Prince Thierry, reportedly descended into a near-manic obsession, pouring vast sums into spies and informants scouring Europe for whispers of truth. Yet every new thread only tangled the web further. Torture chambers echoed with confessions that dissolved under scrutiny. One kitchen boy admitted to accepting a bribe to add a mysterious powder to certain dishes, but died under interrogation before revealing his employer. A wine merchant confessed to delivering specific bottles to certain tables, claiming he was instructed only to meet special dietary requirements. Each clue led deeper into darkness, yielding nothing conclusive, only more names, more theories, and more fear. Meanwhile, King Henry of Trastamara moved with ruthless efficiency. While publicly proclaiming horror and grief over the massacre, he seized the opportunity to solidify his grip on Castile. Within weeks, he installed loyalists into key territories once controlled by nobles who had perished at Mont Blanc. Treaties were swiftly renegotiated, ensuring that whatever power the Castile-Burgundy alliance might have wielded died alongside Isabella and Tierry. It was a masterstroke of realpolitik, cold, calculated, and utterly merciless. In the chronicles of historical true crime, Henry's maneuvers stand as stark proof that sometimes political murder achieves its aims even without formal confession or proof. Burgundy, by contrast, retreated inward. The once lavish court, renowned across Europe for its brilliance and cultural patronage, grew paranoid and insular. Duke Philip's grief transformed Mont Blanc from a symbol of triumph into a cursed monument. Artists who once flocked to the Burgundian court now whispered of haunted halls of blood that would not wash from the castle stones. Diplomatic envoys reported frosty receptions where once they'd been greeted with music and banquets. In this new landscape, even marriages, the ancient tools of royal diplomacy, were eyed with suspicion. Across Europe, protocols for noble gatherings transformed overnight. Tasting dishes became mandatory. Hosts began eating first to prove food's safety. In some courts, nobles were ordered to bring their own provisions, leading to tense banquets where guests unpacked personal silverware and bread loaves, each man trusting no one but himself. And while politics shifted and kingdoms recalibrated their alliances, rumors continued to metastasize. Chroniclers penned lurid accounts, some blending fact with imagination, further muddying the waters of truth. One monk claimed in his writings that the walls of Mont Blanc wept blood every September. Tales spread of ghostly banquets replaying the massacre each year, with spectral nobles raising poisoned goblets in an eternal silent toast. Even Niccolò Machiavelli, writing more than a century later, cited the massacre as an example of ruthless political expediency, a medieval conspiracy that wiped out rivals in a single devastating stroke. Yet, through all the legends, one brutal truth remained: no definitive proof ever emerged. No trial ever condemned a mastermind. The poisoned feast at Mont Blanc remains Europe's most enigmatic, unsolved royal mystery, a wound in the chronicles of dark history that refuses to close. And so the search for answers persists even into our modern age, as historians, forensic scientists, and seekers of secrets pore over faded manuscripts, coded letters, and ancient bones. For the legacy of the royal wedding massacre does not end merely with its politics. It seeps deeper into culture, art, and the collective nightmares of a continent still haunted by that day when love and celebration became instruments of mass murder, a darkness whose shadows stretch even into the legacy that echoes to this day. Long after the blood had dried on Mont Blanc's stones, the true impact of the royal wedding massacre rippled outward, leaving scars not only on dynasties and political borders, but etched into the soul of Europe itself. It became more than a historical true crime. It became a living legend, a cautionary tale woven into the fabric of dark history. For while kings and dukes scrambled to secure thrones and lands, the people, the bards, the chroniclers, the monks, and the merchants found in the poisoned wedding a story so vivid, so shocking, that it demanded retelling again and again. Within mere months, ballads echoing through the taverns of Castile and Burgundy began spinning the tragedy into song. Troubadours sang of the young couple whose wedding feast had turned to a banquet of death, their lyrics gilded with both pity and horror. Each performance exaggerated new details. Some claimed that goblets bled crimson before lips touched them, others that ghostly figures had been seen pouring powder into wine. In these tavern tales, Isabella and Tierry were transformed from political pawns into star-crossed lovers' martyrs to ambition and treachery. Such retellings turned the poisoned feast into a medieval conspiracy that captivated every corner of Europe. Chroniclers, too, seized upon the massacre. The anonymous monk who penned the notorious Chronicle of the Black Feast offered lurid descriptions of the dying nobility writhing across golden plates, mixing historical detail with fantastical visions of angels battling demons above the Great Hall. Though historians today dismiss much of his account as embellishment, his chronicle ensured the massacre's place in the grim pantheon of Europe's dark history. Even Dante's lesser-known contemporary Cecca wove references to the poisoned wedding into his verses, treating the event as divine retribution for human pride and ambition. Artists and artisans found inspiration in the tragedy. Within a decade, a fresco appeared in the Cathedral of Barcelona, depicting Mont Blanc's Great Hall. At the precise moment of revelation, nobles clawing at their throats, crimson, staining fine silks, angels and demons battling for noble souls overhead. The fresco's stark contrast, earthly opulence collapsing into hellish torment, became one of medieval Europe's most powerful visual metaphors for betrayal and the fragility of human glory. But perhaps the most profound legacy of the royal wedding massacre was psychological. In the centuries that followed, a subtle but permanent shift spread through European court culture. Trust, once a prized currency among royals, became suspect. Banquets that had once been glittering arenas for diplomacy were shadowed by fear. Official tasters became indispensable fixtures at noble feasts, their duty no longer ceremonial, but critical to survival. In some courts, the host was required to sample every dish first, a custom that turned hospitality into a deadly test of loyalty. In others, nobles carried their own food and utensils, each morsel a private act of self-defense. The poisoned feast had demonstrated that no sacred rite, not even marriage blessed by the church, was safe from the blades of political ambition, and that was a lesson none would soon forget. The massacre also ignited the early embers of forensic science. Driven by desperation and terror, physicians, alchemists, and scholars across Europe began studying poisons in earnest. The University of Paris founded special councils to analyze toxic substances, while Italian city-states, long renowned for their clandestine arts, found sudden new demand for their expertise in antidotes and detection. In this way, the horrors of Mont Blanc became a grim laboratory, advancing Europe's understanding of toxicology by decades. Economically, the aftershocks were equally severe. Banking houses, particularly the powerful Medici Bank, reported losses equivalent to several years' profits because nobles who died at Mont Blanc had left debts unpaid, their estates thrown into chaos. Trade routes, once anticipated to flourish under the Castile-Burgundy alliance, fell into dispute. The fragile web of credit alliances and commerce that tied medieval Europe together trembled under the strain, proving that a single conspiracy could reverberate far beyond the banquet hall. Even the church was not spared. Having lost 3 bishops and numerous clergy in the massacre, the Catholic hierarchy grappled with a theological crisis. Could those slain at the poisoned wedding be counted as martyrs? Some churchmen declared the massacre divine punishment for the nobility's pride. Others insisted the victims died in a state of grace, transforming the tragedy into a kind of religious sacrifice. This debate rippled through monasteries and pulpits, adding yet another layer of spiritual gravity to an already earth-shaking event. Yet, for all the political, economic, and religious consequences, perhaps the most enduring legacy of the royal wedding massacre is how it fused fact and legend into an eternal cautionary tale, a dark history that refuses to die. To this day, local traditions claim that on certain September nights, Mont Blanc's walls weep blood, and the echo of a final toast can be heard before fading into screams. Some whisper that a spectral bride and groom appear in the great hall, locked in a deadly embrace, replaying their last moments as eternal witnesses to the price of unchecked ambition. And so, as centuries have passed, historians, true crime enthusiasts, and seekers of Europe's most chilling secrets continue to pore over ancient chronicles and coded documents, chasing clues through shadows, determined to solve the unsolved royal mystery. For the poisoned feast of Mont Blanc was never merely about a single night of horror. It became a symbol of how civilization itself can turn against those who trust it most, and how even the brightest moments of joy can harbor the seeds of darkness. Yet beyond the legends, beyond the ballads and frescoes, there remains the human story, 2 young royals barely out of childhood who dreamed that love might exist, even within the iron chains of politics. Their deaths remind us that behind every historical true crime, beyond the whispers of conspiracy, lie real lives cut short. And it is toward that human cost that our gaze now turns as we approach the closing chapter of this tale, a reflection on what the poisoned wedding of Isabella and Tierry truly means for us all. As we stand 6 centuries removed from that blood-soaked hall in Mont Blanc, the echoes of the royal wedding massacre still ripple through the corridors of dark history. For this was never merely a tale of poisoned goblets and noble corpses. It was a mirror reflecting the ugliest truths of human ambition. It was the night when civilization itself turned upon its brightest ideals, when sacred vows were twisted into instruments of murder, and when joy became the camouflage for the deadliest of conspiracies. In the tapestry of historical true crime, few threads are woven so intricately with both horror and sorrow as the poisoned feast that claimed Isabella and Tierry. We remember the faces behind the crowns. Isabella, barely 19, whose letters to Tierry carried the fragile hope that a political marriage might also become a bond of the heart. Tierry, just 23, a prince who seemed to bridge the worlds of soldier and statesman, whose gifts dazzled a royal court, but whose life ended in convulsions upon a rush-strewn floor. These were not merely pawns on a chessboard. They were human beings, whose laughter once echoed through castle halls, who dreamed, who believed that even in a world scarred by wars and betrayals, there might be space for something as delicate as love. That their story ended in blood and betrayal makes the tragedy not merely political, but deeply painfully human. For all the geopolitical tremors it unleashed, the massacre at Mont Blanc leaves behind one question that gnaws at the roots of trust itself. How safe are we truly when seated among those we call allies, friends, even family? In medieval Europe, the poisoned cup became the perfect metaphor for treachery hidden beneath silken words. And though centuries have passed, the lesson remains chillingly relevant. Power has always bred paranoia. Even today, alliances shift in moments, confidences are traded like currency, and smiles can hide blades. The royal wedding massacre reminds us that beneath the gilded rituals of civilization lurks a truth as old as humanity, where power is at stake. No bond, not love, not blood, not faith is truly sacred. In the grand theater of Europe's dark history, Mont Blanc stands as both stage and cautionary tale. It was a massacre that spurred the growth of toxicology, that rewrote the protocols of royal feasts, that inspired paintings, ballads, and legends which still haunt the collective memory of Europe. But perhaps its cruelest legacy is how it murdered trust itself. After Mont Blanc, every toast was suspect. Every banquet became a potential battlefield. The idea that joy could so swiftly transform into terror planted seeds of suspicion that grew into thorny walls around every throne room, council chamber, and diplomatic table. And yet, for all its darkness, the story of the poisoned feast grips us precisely because it is human. It reveals not monsters, but men and women, flesh and blood, who carried dreams, ambitions, and vulnerabilities. The conspirators may have vanished into legend, their names swallowed by time, but their deeds continue to resonate because they remind us how thin the veneer of civilization truly is. That behind every glittering celebration might lurk those who would trade lives for power poison, for diplomacy death for a moment of political advantage. In that sense, the royal wedding massacre is not merely a medieval story, it's a timeless warning. Even as modern historians pore over ancient letters and forensic scientists analyze trace toxins on pottery fragments, the mystery endures. No definitive proof has ever emerged. The ciphered documents discovered in a hidden wall of a monastery remain partially undecoded, their secrets tantalizingly close, yet forever out of reach. Some believe multiple conspiracies converged by accident that day, others that a single mastermind orchestrated every lethal detail. Perhaps we will never know the full truth. Perhaps, as Machiavelli suggested, there are plots so perfectly executed that history can only guess at their authors. But one truth remains undeniable. The poisoned wedding of Isabella and Tierry stands as a testament to how ambition, when left unchecked, devours not only its enemies, but its own creators. It shows us that when power becomes an idol, even love can be sacrificed on its altar. It reminds us that civilization, for all its art and music and glittering ceremonies, is a fragile construct forever vulnerable to the darkness within the human heart. And so, when we hear the tales of Mont Blanc whispered across centuries, when we see the frescoes of angels and demons battling over noble souls, or when we feel a chill at stories of walls weeping blood, each September, we are not merely remembering an ancient massacre. We are confronting the same eternal question: how far will those who seek power go to seize it, and at what cost? The royal wedding massacre is more than history. It is a cautionary tale echoing across time, warning us that trust in the corridors of power can be deadlier than any blade, and that sometimes the deadliest poison is not in the cup, but in the human soul itself. And as the last echoes of this dark chronicle fade into silence, we turn to you, the seeker of history's secrets, the listener drawn to tales where truth and horror entwine to decide what lessons this blood-soaked feast holds for our world today. So now, as the dust of 600 years settles over the silent halls of Mont Blanc, we're left standing before a question that refuses to fade: what truly drives human beings to turn a celebration of love into an arena of death? For the poisoned wedding of Isabella and Tierry is not merely a chapter in Europe's dark history, it is a stark reminder that beneath the jeweled crowns and gilded halls, human ambition can transform even the purest rituals into weapons of destruction. In the chronicles of historical true crime, Few stories cut so deeply because they reveal not only political schemes, but the terrifying ease with which trust becomes the perfect camouflage for murder. In the centuries since that fateful day, kings have risen and fallen. Empires have been born and dissolved into dust. Science has marched forward, shedding light on mysteries our ancestors could barely name. And yet the royal wedding massacre lingers like a phantom at the edges of our collective memory. It remains one of Europe's most chilling, unsolved royal mysteries, a medieval conspiracy shrouded in coded documents, vanished witnesses, and 1,000 conflicting theories. Even modern forensic science, with its DNA analysis and chemical testing of ancient pottery shards, has yet to pin down a single mastermind with certainty. The shadows that swallowed Isabella and Tierry still lie thick across the centuries, and perhaps that is why their story refuses to die. There's something in this tale that speaks to a truth far older than medieval castles or royal bloodlines. It whispers a warning that even the grandest institutions can crumble under the weight of human fear and greed. That joy so radiant in the bright lights of a wedding feast can curdle into terror in a heartbeat. And that sometimes the true poison is not the toxin slipped into a jeweled goblet, but the ambition that slips into the human soul. The royal wedding massacre stands as a symbol that resonates even now in boardrooms, parliaments, and digital spaces where alliances are forged and broken with the stroke of a pen or a single whispered rumor. It's a story that transcends time because it speaks to the core of who we are and how fragile our illusions of safety truly remain. Think about the glittering procession of Isabella entering Mont Blanc, her gown of gold-threaded silk shimmering in torchlight, her eyes bright with hope. Think of Tierry, whose gifts dazzled the assembled nobles, whose voice echoed with promises of peace. In those final moments before the poisoned feast began, they were not merely prince and princess. They were the embodiment of possibility, of the idea that even in an age of endless war, human beings might still carve out a space for love, unity, and hope. That this dream was slaughtered alongside them is perhaps the cruelest legacy of all. And yet, we tell their story still. We paint frescoes of angels and demons battling over noble souls. We sing ballads in smoky taverns, repeating tales of ghostly banquets where goblets drip crimson under spectral chandeliers. We study documents, parse ciphers, and whisper theories late into the night. Because deep down, we crave to know not merely who committed the crime, but whether the world we live in today is any safer, any wiser, any less prone to such darkness. The royal wedding massacre endures not only because it's a spectacular historical true crime, but because it confronts us with the uncomfortable question, how far would we go to protect power, and how many would we sacrifice along the way? And so, as we close the heavy doors of Mont Blanc Castle behind us, as we leave behind the echoes of trumpets and the clink of poisoned crystal goblets, we carry with us a story that refuses to stay buried. A story that warns us that civilization is not an armor. It is a fragile veil easily torn by those who hunger for power above all else. The poisoned wedding of Isabella and Tierry is a monument both to love's vulnerability and ambition's ruthlessness. It demands that we look beyond royal regalia and recognize the shadows that can fall across even the brightest halls. If walls can weep blood, if music can fade into screams, then no alliance, however sacred, is immune from betrayal. That is the bitter legacy of the royal wedding massacre. A legacy that whispers to us even now, trust can be deadlier than any blade, and ambition, when left unchecked, can poison not just goblets, but the very soul of humanity. So what do you think truly happened that fateful day? Was it a single mastermind or a tangle of conspiracies converging in one lethal moment? Was it political calculation, personal revenge, or simply the eternal hunger for power? Share your theories in the comments below, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and join us as we continue exploring the darkest corners of history where secrets still lie waiting to be unearthed. Because in the world of dark history and historical true crime, sometimes the dead still have stories left to tell. In the end, the poisoned wedding of Isabella and Tierry is not just a medieval tragedy, it's a warning that echoes across centuries. It reminds us that beneath the silken banners and the glittering feasts of any age, even our own, there lies a question as sharp as any dagger: can we ever truly know who sits beside us? This is why stories like the Royal Wedding Massacre haunt us, because they force us to confront the truth that trust so vital, so precious, is also the most dangerous gamble we ever make. And yet, as dark as this tale is, it also shines a single undeniable light. The answer to betrayal is not endless suspicion, but vigilance and courage. We can't choose the world we're born into, but we can choose to open our eyes to question and to protect what matters most. And that's why I believe stories like this deserve to be told. Not just to thrill or chill us, but to arm us, to remind us that while ambition can poison a goblet, it's awareness and knowledge that can save a kingdom or a life. So let me ask you, who do you think orchestrated this massacre? Was it one cunning mastermind or a perfect storm of conspiracies colliding in a single lethal night? Drop your theories in the comments. I read everyone. Let's unravel this dark history together. If this story has left you thinking or questioning, then don't let it fade into the shadows. Hit the like button, save this video so you can revisit the clues, and subscribe for more journeys into the hidden corners of history, where secrets still breathe beneath the dust of time. Because in the world of historical true crime, sometimes the dead have more to tell us than the living ever will. And the next story might just change the way you see everything. So, stay curious, stay questioning, and until next time, watch your cup.